In the scorching heat of Afghanistan's Helmand province, where the sun beats down mercilessly on the dusty terrain and every shadow could hide an enemy, courage isn't measured by the size of your weapon or the thickness of your armor. Sometimes, it's measured by the willingness of one person to step into the unknown, knowing that survival depends not on firepower, but on something much more fragile: trust, quick thinking, and the thin line between life and death. This is the story of Staff Sergeant Maya Rodriguez, a 28-year-old communications specialist from Texas, whose routine patrol turned into a nightmare that would test everything she believed about duty, survival, and what it truly means to fight when you're outnumbered 25-1. In a world where split-second decisions can mean the difference between coming home alive or in a flag-draped coffin, Maya was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous battles are fought not with bullets, but with the courage to do what's right when everything around you is falling apart. What happened on that dusty morning in September would either make her a hero or claim her life. There would be no middle ground. The morning air in Camp Leatherneck carried the familiar mix of dust, diesel fuel, and the lingering smell of yesterday's MREs. Staff Sergeant Maya Rodriguez adjusted the strap of her M4 carbine as she walked across the compound, her boots crunching on the gravel path that separated the communications center from the motor pool. At 28, she had already completed 2 tours in Afghanistan, but this third deployment felt different somehow. Maybe it was the way the Taliban had been testing their perimeter defenses more frequently, or maybe it was just the weight of knowing that back home in San Antonio, her daughter Sophia was starting kindergarten without her. Maya had joined the army at 19, driven by a desire to serve her country and escape the cycle of poverty that had trapped her family for generations. Her father, Miguel, had worked double shifts at a meatpacking plant to keep food on the table, while her mother, Carmen, cleaned office buildings at night to make ends meet. The military had offered Maya something her parents never had: stability, purpose, and a chance to build a better future for herself and, eventually, her own family. Her specialty as a communications specialist had kept her relatively safe during her previous deployments. While infantry soldiers kicked down doors and mounted patrols through dangerous neighborhoods, Maya typically stayed on base, maintaining radio equipment, coordinating satellite communications, and ensuring that vital information flowed seamlessly between units in the field. It was technical work that required precision and attention to detail, qualities that had earned her respect from both her peers and superiors. But today was different. Captain James Morrison had requested her specifically for a routine communications check at Forward Operating Base Chapman, a smaller outpost about 15 kilometers north of their main base. The FOB had been experiencing intermittent radio problems, and local Afghan forces stationed there needed their communication systems fully operational before a planned joint patrol scheduled for the following week. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. Maya would ride with a small convoy to Chapman, spend a few hours troubleshooting their radio equipment, train the local Afghan communications operator on proper maintenance procedures, and return to Leatherneck before evening chow. It was the kind of mission she had completed dozens of times before, the routine maintenance work that kept the larger war machine functioning smoothly. As she approached the staging area, Maya could see the 3-vehicle convoy already forming up. 2 mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, known as MRAPs, would provide security, while she would ride in the middle vehicle with her equipment and a small team of soldiers. The MRAPs were massive, heavily armored beasts designed to withstand improvised explosive devices, the preferred weapon of insurgents who couldn't match American forces in conventional combat. Sergeant First Class David Park, the convoy commander, was conducting his final briefing with the drivers and vehicle commanders. Park was a career soldier from Oregon, methodical and careful, the kind of leader who double-checked everything and never took unnecessary risks. Maya had worked with him before and trusted his judgment completely. "Weather's clear, no significant threat reports along our route," Park was saying as Maya approached. "Intel suggests normal levels of insurgent activity in the area, but nothing specific. We'll take Highway 617 north to the junction, then cut west on the dirt road to Chapman. Total travel time should be about 40 minutes each way." Maya nodded as she listened, mentally reviewing her equipment checklist. She carried a portable radio analyzer, replacement circuit boards, a laptop loaded with diagnostic software, and various cables and adapters. Her personal gear included her M4 rifle, 210 rounds of ammunition, body armor, helmet, first aid kit, and 3 bottles of water. The temperature was already climbing toward what forecasters predicted would be another scorching day, with highs reaching 115 degrees Fahrenheit. The soldiers assigned to her convoy were a mix of experienced veterans and newer personnel on their first deployment. Private First Class Tommy Chun, barely 20 years old, would be her driver. Despite his youth, Chun had proven himself to be steady under pressure and had an almost supernatural ability to spot potential roadside bombs. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, a tough Latina from Los Angeles, would serve as Maya's security escort and help with the technical work if needed. As they loaded their gear, Maya found herself thinking about her daughter Sophia. The little girl's last video call had been filled with excited chatter about her new teacher, her new backpack covered with princesses, and how she had made a friend named Emma who also liked to color. Sophia had asked when Mommy was coming home, and Maya had given her the same answer she always did. Soon, baby girl. Mommy will be home soon. The truth was more complicated. This deployment was scheduled to last 12 months, and they were only 5 months in. 7 more months felt like an eternity when measured in missed bedtime stories, school plays she wouldn't attend, and holidays celebrated through pixelated video connections. But Maya believed in the mission, believed that her work here was making a difference, and believed that the sacrifice would ultimately be worth it for Sophia's future. The convoy rolled out of Camp Leatherneck at precisely 0800 hours, the time chosen to avoid both the pre-dawn hours when insurgents often planted roadside bombs and the intense heat of midday. Maya sat in the back of the middle MRAP, her equipment secured beside her, watching the Afghan landscape roll past through the thick, bulletproof windows. The countryside was surprisingly beautiful in the early morning light. Rolling hills covered with sparse vegetation stretched toward distant mountains that looked almost purple in the haze. Occasional villages appeared along their route, clusters of mud brick compounds where Afghan families had lived for generations, largely unchanged by the presence of foreign armies or the promise of modern democracy. Maya had learned during her previous deployments that Afghanistan was a country of contradictions. Ancient trade routes crossed landscapes where opium poppies grew beside wheat fields. Farmers who welcomed American soldiers during the day might shelter Taliban fighters at night, not out of ideological conviction but from the practical need to survive in a country where the government's authority often extended only as far as the nearest checkpoint. The first part of their journey passed without incident. Highway 617 was a relatively secure route, regularly patrolled by coalition forces and generally free of insurgent activity. Local Afghan National Army units maintained checkpoints at strategic intervals, and the road itself was in decent condition by Afghan standards. Maya used the travel time to review technical manuals on her laptop and prepare for the troubleshooting work ahead. Forward Operating Base Chapman had been established. The communications bunker at Forward Operating Base Chapman was a concrete structure built into the side of a small hill, designed to protect vital radio equipment from both enemy fire and the harsh Afghan climate. Maya followed Lieutenant Colonel Ahmad Hassani, the Afghan officer in charge of base communications, down a narrow stairway that led to the underground facility. The air inside was cooler than the rising heat outside, but it carried the distinctive smell of electronic equipment and the mustiness of a space that never received natural sunlight. Hassani was a career soldier who had served in the Afghan National Army for over 15 years, surviving the chaos of civil war, Taliban rule, and now the American-led effort to rebuild his country's military. He spoke excellent English, having trained for 6 months at Fort Benning in Georgia, and Maya immediately appreciated his technical knowledge and professional demeanor. Unlike some Afghan officers who seemed more interested in the status and privileges of rank than in actual military competence, Hassani clearly understood his equipment and took pride in maintaining it properly. The problems began 3 days ago, Hassani explained as they examined the main radio console. First, we lost contact with our patrol units in the southern sector. Then, yesterday, we could not reach the district headquarters in Marja. This morning, Even our backup radio systems are showing irregularities. Maya opened her equipment case and began connecting diagnostic cables to the radio stack. Her portable analyzer would run comprehensive tests on each component, checking signal strength, frequency stability, and data integrity. She had troubleshot similar problems before, and experience told her that the issue was probably something relatively simple: a corroded connection, a failing power supply, or interference from nearby electronic devices. As her equipment ran its initial scans, Maya noticed something that made her pause. The radio logs showed an unusual pattern of transmission attempts over the past week. Someone had been trying to establish contact with units that weren't supposed to exist, using call signs that didn't match any coalition or Afghan National Army designations. The attempts had been brief and had occurred during odd hours, mostly between midnight and 3 in the morning. "Lieutenant Colonel, can you explain these entries in your transmission log?" Maya asked, pointing to the anomalous records on her laptop screen. Hassani leaned over to examine the data, his expression growing troubled. "I do not recognize these call signs," he said slowly. "And I was not aware that anyone had been attempting these transmissions. My night operators should have reported any unusual activity." A cold knot began forming in Maya's stomach. In Afghanistan, unauthorized radio transmissions often indicated insurgent activity. Taliban forces frequently tried to monitor coalition communications or infiltrate radio networks to gather intelligence. But the pattern she was seeing suggested something more sophisticated than typical insurgent eavesdropping. Someone with detailed knowledge of military radio protocols had been systematically testing the base's communications systems. Maya continued her diagnostic work, but now she was looking for signs of more than just equipment failure. She ran spectrum analysis software that could detect unauthorized transmissions and checked the base's frequency assignments against a classified database of known insurgent radio signatures. What she found made her blood run cold. The radio systems at Chapman had been compromised. Someone had installed sophisticated monitoring equipment that was intercepting and recording all communications traffic. The equipment was well hidden, integrated into the existing radio stack in a way that suggested technical expertise and inside knowledge of the base's communication systems. Worse, the monitoring equipment appeared to be transmitting summary reports to an external location, probably using burst transmissions that would be difficult to detect without specialized equipment. "Lieutenant Colonel, we have a serious problem," Maya said, her voice steady despite the implications of what she had discovered. "Your communication systems have been compromised. Someone has been monitoring all your radio traffic and sending reports to an outside location." Hassani's face went pale as he absorbed this information. A compromised communication system meant that insurgent forces had been listening to their patrol schedules, supply convoys, and operational plans. Any mission discussed over the radio during the past week had potentially been exposed to enemy forces. The implications were staggering and potentially deadly. Maya immediately began documenting her findings, photographing the unauthorized equipment and downloading log files that would provide evidence of the security breach. Her training kicked in as she followed established protocols for handling compromised communication systems. First, isolate the affected equipment to prevent further intelligence leaks. Second, establish secure communication with higher headquarters to report the breach. Third, begin forensic analysis to determine the scope of the compromise and identify potential security vulnerabilities. But as she worked, Maya became aware of increasing activity around the base. Through the bunker's small windows, she could see Afghan soldiers moving with more urgency than the situation seemed to warrant. Vehicle engines were starting up in the motor pool, and she could hear voices speaking rapidly in Pashto, the dominant local language that she understood only in fragments. Lieutenant Colonel Hassani excused himself to check on the activity outside, leaving Maya alone in the communications bunker. She continued her work, but something felt wrong. The base's reaction to her discovery of the compromised communications seemed disproportionate. A security breach was serious, but it shouldn't cause the level of mobilization she was observing. Maya tried to establish contact with her own base using her portable satellite radio, but she was having difficulty getting a clear signal. The mountainous terrain around Chapman often interfered with satellite communications, but today the interference seemed worse than usual. After several failed attempts, she managed to establish a weak connection with the communications center at Camp Leatherneck. Leatherneck Base, this is Rodriguez at Chapman. I need to report a priority security issue. The communication systems here have been compromised by unknown parties. Request immediate guidance on containment procedures. The response was broken and difficult to understand due to static, but Maya caught enough to realize that something else was happening. Rodriguez, we have reports of increased insurgent activity in your sector. Recommend you complete your mission quickly and prepare for immediate extraction. Convoy support may not be available due to developing situation. Before Maya could respond for clarification, the satellite connection failed completely. She tried repeatedly to re-establish contact, but received only static. Her portable radio, which had worked perfectly during the morning convoy, now seemed unable to reach any of the frequencies she needed. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Lieutenant Colonel Hassani returned to the bunker, and Maya immediately noticed that his demeanor had changed. Where he had been cooperative and concerned before, now he seemed nervous and evasive. When she asked about the increased activity outside, his explanations were vague and contradictory. He mentioned a training exercise that had been scheduled, but couldn't provide details about its scope or duration. Maya's military training had taught her to trust her instincts, and every instinct was now telling her that she was in danger. The compromised communications, the loss of satellite contact, the unusual activity around the base, and the change in Hassani's behavior all pointed Maya's worst fears materialized when Lieutenant Colonel Hassani returned to the bunker accompanied by 4 Afghan soldiers she didn't recognize. These men were different from the regular Afghan National Army personnel she had encountered earlier. They moved with the disciplined precision of special forces, their equipment was newer and better maintained, and their eyes held a hardness that spoke of extensive combat experience. Most unsettling of all, they positioned themselves strategically around the bunker in a way that blocked all exits. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Hassani said, his previous friendly demeanor now replaced by cold formality. I'm afraid there has been a change in plans. You will need to remain here until we can resolve some security concerns that have arisen. Maya's hand instinctively moved closer to her weapon, but she forced herself to remain calm and analytical. 5 armed men in a confined space meant that any direct confrontation would likely end badly for her. Instead, she needed to buy time, gather information, and look for opportunities to escape or establish communication with friendly forces. Her survival training kicked in as she began assessing the tactical situation with the clinical detachment of a professional soldier. What kind of security concerns? Maya asked, maintaining eye contact with Hassani while using her peripheral vision to track the positions of the other soldiers. If there's a threat to the base, shouldn't we be coordinating with my convoy team? Hassani's smile was thin and humorless. Your convoy team departed 20 minutes ago. They received orders to return to Camp Leatherneck immediately due to reports of insurgent activity along their return route. Unfortunately, there was no time to collect you and your equipment. You will remain here as our guest until the situation stabilizes. Maya felt her heart rate spike as the implications became clear. She was now completely isolated, surrounded by personnel whose loyalty was questionable, and cut off from any possibility of rescue or support. Worse, the story about her convoy receiving orders to leave didn't ring true. Sergeant Park would never abandon a team member without direct confirmation of her status, and standard operating procedures required positive accountability for all personnel before any convoy movement. I need to verify those orders with my commanding officer, Maya said, reaching for her satellite radio. I am afraid that will not be possible, one of the unknown soldiers said in heavily accented English. He was older than the others, probably in his 40s, with graying hair and scars that suggested extensive combat experience. Communications equipment is being tested as part of our security review. All external transmissions are currently prohibited. The situation was rapidly deteriorating, but Maya forced herself to think strategically rather than emotionally. She was outnumbered and outgunned in an underground bunker with limited escape routes. Her best chance of survival lay in playing along while looking for opportunities to turn the tables or escape. She had been trained for prisoner of war scenarios, and many of those same principles applied to her current situation. Maya nodded as if accepting their explanation while mentally cataloging everything she observed. The four unknown soldiers carried AK-47 rifles, but she noticed that their equipment was unusually well maintained, and their tactical gear included items not typically issued to Afghan National Army units. Night vision devices, advanced radio headsets, and body armor that looked suspiciously like equipment used by elite forces. These men were not regular soldiers. "Very well," Maya said. "Since I'll be here longer than expected, perhaps I can continue working on your communication systems. I've identified several issues that need immediate attention." Hassani consulted briefly with the older soldier in rapid Pashto before responding. "Yes, that would be acceptable. However, you will work under close supervision, and any equipment modifications must be approved before implementation." Maya understood that they wanted her to continue her work, which suggested that her discovery of the compromised communications had not derailed their plans, but might actually be part of them. Perhaps they needed her technical expertise to complete whatever operation they had planned. This realization gave her a small measure of leverage, even in her compromised position. As she resumed her diagnostic work, Maya began to piece together a clearer picture of what was happening. The compromised radio systems had not been infiltrated by outside insurgents, but had been intentionally modified by personnel within the base itself. Lieutenant Colonel Hassani was either a willing participant or was being coerced to cooperate. The four unknown soldiers were probably Taliban special forces or foreign fighters with advanced training and equipment. Most troubling of all, her arrival at the base seemed to have triggered a predetermined sequence of events. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Someone had known that she was coming and had planned to use her presence for their own purposes. This suggested that the compromised communications extended beyond forward operating base Chapman and might include personnel at Camp Leatherneck or even higher levels of command. Maya continued working while covertly observing her captors and looking for opportunities to improve her situation. The bunker had 3 exits. The main stairway she had used to enter, a narrow emergency exit that led to a ventilation shaft, and a service tunnel that connected to the base's power generation facility. All 3 exits were currently being watched, but the guards' attention was not constant. As the afternoon progressed, Maya noticed increasing activity throughout the base. More vehicles were arriving, and she could hear helicopters in the distance. Through the bunker's small windows, she observed personnel moving equipment and establishing what appeared to be defensive positions around the perimeter. Whatever operation was unfolding, it was larger than just detaining one American soldier. Around 3 o'clock, Hassani received a radio transmission that caused him obvious agitation. He spoke rapidly in Pashto with the older soldier, their conversation becoming increasingly heated. Maya couldn't understand most of what was being said, but she caught several words that made her blood run cold. Americans, helicopters, and attack. The older soldier ended the conversation by barking orders to his men. 2 of them immediately left the bunker, while the remaining guard positioned himself more strategically near the main exit. Hassani approached Maya with barely concealed nervousness. "Staff Sergeant, I need you to establish communication with your headquarters immediately. Tell them that you have completed your mission successfully and that you will remain at Chapman overnight to complete additional maintenance work. Emphasize that no extraction is necessary and that all personnel at the base are safe and accounted for." Maya realized that she was being asked to participate in deception that could endanger other American forces. Whatever operation was unfolding, they needed her to provide false information to prevent interference from coalition forces. This was her moment of decision: cooperate and possibly survive while enabling enemy operations, or refuse and accept the likely consequences. "I cannot provide false reports to my superiors," Maya said firmly. "My duty as an American soldier requires me to report accurately on the situation here." The temperature in the bunker seemed to drop several degrees as the older soldier stepped forward. "Perhaps you do not fully understand your situation, Staff Sergeant. You are now a prisoner of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Your cooperation is not optional, it is required. You will make the transmission as instructed, or you will face consequences that you will find most unpleasant. Maya felt a surge of clarity as her training took over. The first explosion shook the entire bunker, sending dust cascading from the concrete ceiling and knocking equipment off tables. Maya instinctively dropped to the ground as the lights flickered and the building's structure groaned under the impact. Through the small windows, she could see the orange flash of rocket strikes hitting defensive positions around the base perimeter, followed by the sustained roar of automatic weapons fire. The older soldier who had been interrogating her was now shouting commands into his radio, while simultaneously trying to coordinate the defense of the base. Maya realized that this was her moment of opportunity. In the chaos of the developing battle, the attention of her captors was focused on the external threat rather than on controlling their prisoner. She had perhaps seconds to act before they either killed her to prevent rescue or dragged her deeper into the base where extraction would be impossible. Maya rolled toward her equipment case, grabbing a heavy radio analyzer that she swung with all her strength at the remaining guard's knee. The impact sent him sprawling across the concrete floor, his AK-47 clattering away from his hands. Before he could recover, Maya had scooped up his weapon and positioned herself behind a bank of radio equipment that provided cover from the main entrance. The older soldier spun toward her, raising his own weapon, but Maya was faster. Her M4 rifle was still slung across her shoulder, and she brought it up in one smooth motion while simultaneously rolling to a new position. Her first 3-round burst caught him center mass, the impact spinning him around and sending him crashing into a rack of communications equipment. Lieutenant Colonel Hassani had been reaching for a pistol on his belt, but he froze when Maya's rifle swung toward him. "Hands up, now!" she commanded in a voice that carried the authority of someone who had just demonstrated her willingness to use lethal force. Hassani slowly raised his hands, his face pale with shock and fear. The wounded guard was groaning on the floor, clutching his injured knee, but apparently not seriously wounded. Maya quickly moved to secure their weapons, while keeping both men covered with her rifle. Above ground, the battle was intensifying. She could hear the distinctive sound of Apache attack helicopters engaging targets with their 30mm chain guns, followed by the deeper rumble of what sounded like AC-130 gunship fire. Someone had authorized significant firepower for this rescue operation, which meant that higher command considered the situation extremely serious. Maya needed to establish communication with the rescue force before they leveled the entire base. Her portable satellite radio had been damaged during the initial explosion, but the base's main communication system was still functional. She forced Hassani to provide her with the frequencies being used by the defensive forces while she worked to patch into their radio network. The technical challenge was complex. The insurgent forces had modified the base's communication systems to monitor coalition traffic, but Maya realized she could reverse that capability to break into their command network. Using her knowledge of military radio protocols and the diagnostic equipment she had brought, she began reconfiguring the system to give her access to the frequencies being used by the attacking forces. Another massive explosion rocked the bunker, this one closer than the first. Maya could hear small arms fired directly above them, which meant that ground forces had breached the base perimeter and were fighting building to building. She needed to work faster before the rescue force decided that the communications bunker was a legitimate target. This is Staff Sergeant Maya Rodriguez, U.S. Army, calling any coalition forces in the area. She transmitted on what she hoped was the correct frequency. "I am being held in the underground communications facility at Chapman. I have secured 2 prisoners and need immediate extraction assistance." The response came immediately, the voice carrying the crisp professionalism of a special operations unit. "Rodriguez, this is Ranger 6. We have your location marked. Can you provide current intel on enemy strength and disposition?" Maya felt a surge of relief at hearing an American voice, but she forced herself to remain focused on the tactical situation. "Ranger 6, this is Rodriguez. Base has been compromised at command level. Estimate 40 to 50 insurgent fighters, well-equipped and disciplined. They were expecting American response and have prepared defensive positions. Be advised that some Afghan National Army personnel are hostile." "Copy that, Rodriguez. We're fighting our way to your position. Can you hold for approximately 10 minutes? 10 minutes felt like an eternity, with explosions shaking the building and gunfire getting closer by the minute. Maya looked around the bunker, assessing her defensive options. The space was cramped and offered limited cover, but the thick concrete walls would stop most small arms fire. She had perhaps 200 rounds of ammunition and 2 prisoners who might or might not cooperate, depending on how the battle developed. Hassani had been listening to the radio exchange with growing alarm. "Staff Sergeant, you must understand that I was forced to cooperate with these men. They threatened to kill my family if I refused to help them. I am not your enemy." Maya studied his face, trying to determine if he was telling the truth or attempting to save himself as the tactical situation deteriorated. The question of Hassani's true allegiances would have to wait. Her immediate priority was survival until the rescue force could reach her. She used her tactical knife to cut zip-tie restraints from her equipment case, securing both prisoners to heavy equipment racks where they couldn't interfere with her defense of the position. The wounded guard was losing blood from his knee injury, but Maya couldn't spare medical attention while under potential attack. The sound of fighting above ground was getting closer. Through the ventilation system, she could hear American voices shouting tactical commands mixed with the distinctive crack of M4 rifles and the heavier bark of M249 squad automatic weapons. But she could also hear return fire from AK-47s and what sounded like a heavy machine gun that was keeping the rescue force from making rapid progress. Maya realized that she might need to contribute to her own rescue. The bunker had multiple exits, and it was possible that insurgent forces might try to use the service tunnels to outflank the American assault or to escape the base entirely. She needed to prevent the bunker from becoming either a refuge for enemy forces or an avenue for their escape. Using her knowledge of completely, she was now officially a prisoner of war, which meant that certain rules applied. She was required to provide only her name, rank, service number, and date of birth. Any cooperation beyond that was voluntary, and she was obligated to resist enemy exploitation to the best of her ability. Rodriguez, Maya Elena. Staff Sergeant, United States Army. Service number 123-45-6789. Date of birth, March 15, 1995. Maya recited in the clear, steady voice she had practiced during survival training. The older soldier's expression hardened. "You will find that your American military training has not prepared you for the realities of your situation. We have methods of persuasion that are quite effective, even with stubborn soldiers." Before he could elaborate on his threat, another soldier burst into the bunker, speaking rapidly in Pashto. Maya caught the word helicopters repeated several times, and she could see the alarm in everyone's expressions. Through the small windows, she could now hear the distinctive sound of approaching aircraft, multiple helicopters flying in formation. The older soldier grabbed a radio and began speaking rapidly, clearly coordinating some kind of response to the approaching aircraft. Maya realized that her disappearance had not gone unnoticed after all. Someone at Camp Leatherneck had realized that the story about her convoy receiving emergency extraction orders didn't match their records, and they had launched a rescue operation. Suddenly, the tactical situation changed completely. Instead of being a helpless prisoner waiting for interrogation or worse, Maya found herself in the middle of a developing firefight between her captors and what she hoped were American rescue forces. The approaching helicopters represented both hope for rescue and the possibility of being caught in the crossfire of a pitched battle. The older soldier barked orders to his remaining subordinate, while Hassani tried desperately to establish radio contact with someone. Maya realized that the next few minutes would determine whether she lived or died, and that her survival might depend on actions she took in the next few seconds. Outside, the sound of helicopters was getting closer, and she could hear the distinctive whine of minigun systems spinning up. The battle for Forward Operating Base Chapman was about to begin, and Staff Sergeant Maya Rodriguez was about to discover whether her years of training had prepared her for the reality of combat when the odds were stacked overwhelmingly against her. To a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of control, she began mentally inventorying her options and assessing potential escape routes. The reality of her situation was becoming clear. She was alone at a remote base with questionable security, Her communications with friendly forces had been severed, and she was beginning to suspect that the compromised radio systems were not the work of outside insurgents, but rather the result of infiltration within the base itself. The Afghan National Army unit stationed at Chapman might be compromised at the highest levels. Maya tried to maintain her composure while continuing her work, but she was now operating under the assumption that she was surrounded by potential enemies. Her M4 rifle was within reach, and she had memorized the location of every exit from the bunker. She began developing contingency plans for different scenarios, from a direct confrontation to an attempt to reach her convoy vehicles in the motor pool. As she worked, Maya overheard fragments of conversations in Pashto coming from the corridor outside the bunker. Her limited understanding of the language allowed her to pick up certain words: American, woman, radio, and most ominously, tonight. The pieces of a larger picture were coming together, and that picture suggested that her discovery of the compromised communications had somehow triggered a predetermined plan. The morning sun continued to climb higher in the Afghan sky, but inside the communications bunker, Maya Rodriguez felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She was beginning to realize that her routine maintenance mission had walked her into the middle of something much larger and more dangerous than equipment failure. The compromised radios were not just a security breach, they were part of a coordinated operation, and she had stumbled into it at exactly the wrong time. Outside the bunker, she could hear more vehicles starting up and the sound of soldiers moving with purpose. Whatever was about to happen, it was beginning now, and Maya found herself at the center of events that she neither understood nor controlled. Her training told her to gather intelligence, maintain operational security, and look for opportunities to escape and report back to friendly forces. But as the morning progressed and her situation became increasingly precarious, Maya began to understand that escape might not be possible and that survival might depend on skills she had never expected to need. The routine mission was about to become a fight for her life, and the odds were not in her favor. Hours earlier, as part of the American strategy to extend government influence into rural areas and deny safe haven to Taliban forces. The base housed about 200 Afghan National Army soldiers, along with a small team of American advisors. Their mission was to train local forces, conduct joint patrols, and gather intelligence about insurgent movements in the region. As their convoy approached the turnoff from the main highway, Maya could see Chapman in the distance. The base was smaller than Leatherneck, but still substantial, surrounded by concrete barriers and razor wire, with guard towers positioned at each corner. An Afghan flag flew alongside an American flag from a pole near the main gate, symbols of the partnership that was supposed to eventually allow Afghan forces to secure their own country. The convoy slowed as they approached the checkpoint. Afghan soldiers in mismatched uniforms emerged from the guardhouse, their AK-47 rifles slung casually across their shoulders. Maya had worked with Afghan forces before and had developed a healthy respect for their resilience and local knowledge, even as she remained constantly aware of the security challenges posed by cultural differences and the ever-present threat of insurgent infiltration. Private Chin brought their MRAP to a stop as an Afghan sergeant approached to check their credentials. The man was middle-aged, with weathered features and intelligent eyes that seemed to assess everything around him. He spoke briefly with Sergeant Park in broken English mixed with a few words of Pashto, examining their movement orders and radio frequencies. After a few minutes, the gates swung open and the convoy rolled into forward operating base Chapman. Maya felt a familiar sense of transition as they moved from the uncertainty of the road to the relative security of the base. She began mentally preparing for the technical work ahead, reviewing the symptoms described in the maintenance request, and planning her diagnostic approach. She had no way of knowing that this routine mission would become anything but routine, or that the communication equipment she was coming to repair would soon become the only thing standing between her and a situation that would test every skill she had learned in 9 years of military service. The morning sun climbed higher in the Afghan sky, and Maya Rodriguez gathered her equipment, ready to begin what she thought would be just another day's work in a war that had already taken so much from so many.